Sarah Mitchell's life changed forever on a sunny afternoon in Atlanta, Georgia, when she was 12 years old. She was sitting in her 7th grade science class when her vision began to blur. At first, she thought it was just tiredness from staying up late studying, but within days, her world started fading into darkness. One evening, as Sarah sat quietly in her room learning to read Braille, James walked in and sat beside her. "Baby girl," he said in his deep, commanding voice, "being blind doesn't mean being helpless. We're going to make sure you can take care of yourself better than anyone else." True to his word, James began Sarah's training the very next day. He started with basic spatial awareness exercises, teaching her to map rooms in her mind and count steps between objects. He would move furniture around randomly, forcing her to adapt and learn to detect obstacles through subtle changes in air pressure and sound. Sarah's mother thought James was being too harsh, but he knew better. He had seen too many disabled veterans give up on life because they weren't taught to adapt. He wouldn't let that happen to his daughter. When Sarah turned 13, James introduced her to his old friend Master Chen, who ran a martial arts school on the outskirts of Atlanta. Chen was known for his unorthodox teaching methods and had experience training visually impaired students. At first, Sarah struggled. She fell countless times, got bruised, and often went to bed sore and frustrated. But something remarkable began to happen. As her training progressed, Sarah's other senses became extraordinarily sharp. She could tell how many people were in a room just by the subtle changes in air currents. She learned to identify different fighting stances by the sound of footsteps and weight distribution. Her sense of touch became so refined that she could read an opponent's next move by the slight tensing of their muscles during contact. Master Chen was amazed by her progress. "In all my years of teaching," he told James, "I've never seen anyone adapt like your daughter. She's not just learning despite being blind. She's becoming better because of it." By the time Sarah was 16, she had earned black belts in 3 different martial arts styles. She combined them with her unique sensory abilities to create her own fighting technique. She could take on multiple opponents in complete darkness, using their confusion and dependence on sight against them. Her high school years were challenging in different ways. Some students bullied her, thinking her an easy target. That changed quickly after an incident in the cafeteria when 3 senior boys tried to steal her lunch. Without breaking a sweat, Sarah had all 3 pinned to the ground, calmly explaining why their behavior was unacceptable. The incident became school legend, and no one dared bother her again. But Sarah was more than just her fighting abilities. She excelled in academics, using audio textbooks and Braille to maintain straight A's. She joined the school debate team and even learned to play the piano, developing a talent that would later become part of her cover story. At 18, she earned a full scholarship to Georgetown University. Her father had taught her that education was just as important as physical training. In college, she majored in international relations with a minor in psychology, understanding that knowledge of human behavior was as crucial as knowing how to fight. During her college years, Sarah continued her martial arts training, finding new teachers and expanding her skill set. She learned to use her heightened senses in urban environments, navigating busy streets and crowded spaces with ease. She could tell the difference between friendly and hostile attention just by listening to breathing patterns and footsteps. What Sarah didn't know was that she was being watched. Her unique abilities had caught the attention of several government agencies. They saw something extraordinary in this young woman who had turned what many considered a disability into an advantage. As she approached graduation, Sarah's life seemed set on a conventional path. She had job offers from several international organizations and was considering a career in disability advocacy. But fate, and her remarkable abilities, had different plans for her. The seeds planted during those early years of training with her father and Master Chen would soon blossom into something far beyond what anyone could have imagined. Sarah Mitchell was about to become one of the most effective covert operatives in U.S. history, though at this point she had no idea that her true calling awaited her. Little did she know that her blindness, the very thing some people pitied her for, would become her greatest asset in a world of shadows and secrets. Sarah's journey into the world of covert operations began on an ordinary Tuesday during her final semester at Georgetown. She was sitting in her favorite coffee shop near campus, reading a Braille textbook, when a woman sat down at her table. "Miss Mitchell," the stranger said softly, "your professor speaks very highly of your thesis on domestic terrorism networks." The woman's voice was calm and measured, but Sarah's trained senses detected something more, a subtle tension, the kind she'd learned to associate with people who were constantly alert. The woman introduced herself as Diana Reynolds from a private security consulting firm, but Sarah, with her heightened ability to detect subtle voice patterns, knew this was only part of the truth. The slight pause before private security told her everything she needed to know. For the next hour, Diana explained that she represented a classified government agency that specialized in unconventional approaches to national security. They had been monitoring Sarah's progress since her remarkable achievements in college, including her ability to detect and prevent a potential bombing at a campus event simply by noticing irregular breathing patterns and nervous movements in a crowd. "We believe your unique abilities could be invaluable to our organization," Diana explained. "Your blindness isn't a limitation, it's an asset we want to develop." The offer was both terrifying and exciting. The agency would provide advanced training, building upon her existing skills while teaching her new ones. They were particularly interested in her ability to detect lies through voice patterns and body language, a skill she had developed to compensate for her lack of visual cues. Sarah spent 3 days considering the offer. Her father, when she called him for advice, was unusually quiet. Finally, he said, "Baby girl, you've spent your whole life proving that limitations only exist in people's minds. Maybe it's time to show the world just how true that is." The training began immediately after graduation. Sarah was taken to a classified facility in Virginia, where she discovered that her previous martial arts training was just the beginning. The agency taught her advanced combat techniques specifically adapted to her abilities. They helped her refine her talent for detecting lies and reading people through non-visual cues. One of her instructors, a former Navy SEAL named Jack Thompson, initially doubted her capabilities. During their first sparring session, he went easy on her. Sarah took him down in seconds, using his own assumptions against him. After that, he became one of her strongest advocates. The agency also taught her the art of blending in. Sarah learned to play up her blindness when needed, allowing people to underestimate her. She became skilled at appearing helpless while gathering crucial intelligence. Her ability to memorize conversations, footsteps, and spatial details without taking notes proved invaluable. Technology training was another crucial component. Sarah learned to use specialized equipment designed for blind operators. She mastered echolocation devices, sophisticated listening tools, and other classified technology that complemented her natural abilities. But the most challenging part of her training was learning to kill. Sarah struggled with this aspect until her instructor helped her understand that sometimes taking a life was necessary to save many others. She learned to be precise and efficient, developing techniques that utilized her unique sensory advantages. During her final test, Sarah was dropped in an unfamiliar location with a complex mission: infiltrate a compound, retrieve sensitive data, and exit undetected. The facility was pitch black, giving sighted operators a disadvantage. Sarah completed the mission in record time, demonstrating why her blindness was indeed her greatest strength. After 6 months of intensive training, Sarah emerged as one of the agency's most promising new operatives. Her code name became Echo, a reference to both her use of sound and the way she seemed to disappear and reappear like an echo in the dark. Her first assignments were relatively simple: surveillance, data gathering, and threat assessment. But with each successful mission, her reputation grew. Other agents began requesting her for complex operations, particularly those requiring exceptional sensory awareness or the ability to operate in low-light conditions. As Sarah prepared for her first major undercover assignment, Diana, now her handler, gave her a piece of advice that would become her mantra: "Let them underestimate you. Their prejudice is your power." Sarah smiled, knowing that her journey from a blind teenager to a covered operative was just the beginning. The real challenges, and her true test, lay ahead in the shadows where she had learned to thrive. The small town of Pine Ridge, Montana, with its population of just over 3,000 people, became Sarah's new home in early spring. Her cover story was simple but effective: a blind piano teacher who had inherited her aunt's house and music studio. The reality was far more complex. The agency had been tracking a dangerous white supremacist group called the Pure Nation Army for months. Intelligence suggested they were using the remote location to stockpile weapons and plan attacks on minority communities across the state. Sarah's mission was to infiltrate their network by becoming an unsuspecting part of the community. During her daily walks with her guide dog, Zeus, actually a highly trained military canine, Sarah mapped the entire town in her mind. She could tell which trucks belonged to suspected gang members by their distinct engine sounds. She learned the patrol patterns of local law enforcement and identified the regular meeting spots of the Pure Nation Army members. The breakthrough came during one of her piano lessons. 8-year-old Jenny Miller, daughter of the local hardware store owner, innocently mentioned that her daddy had been selling lots of pipes and chemicals lately to those men from the church basement. Sarah recognized this as a potential bomb-making operation. Using her enhanced hearing abilities, Sarah started monitoring the church basement during her practice sessions. She installed sophisticated listening devices disguised as musical equipment. The gang members, who often gathered there after hours, never suspected that the blind piano teacher upstairs could hear every word of their conversations through the building's old heating vents. One evening, while practicing late, Sarah intercepted a crucial conversation. The group was planning to receive a major weapons shipment. More importantly, she identified Thomas Wheeler, a former military explosives expert, as their weapons supplier. His distinct limp and breathing pattern made him easy for her to track. But maintaining her cover wasn't always easy. During a town festival, one of the gang members, drunk and belligerent, started harassing a Hispanic family. Sarah had to suppress her instinct to intervene, knowing it would compromise her mission. Instead, she gathered evidence, recording the incident with specialized equipment hidden in her cane. Her daily routine became increasingly dangerous as she gathered more intelligence. She adapted her piano lesson schedule to coincide with the group's meetings, using her students' playing to mask the sound of her surveillance equipment. The children's parents, many of whom were sympathetic to the Pure Nation Army, never suspected that their children's music lessons were providing cover for one of the most sophisticated intelligence operations in the state. Sarah's handler, Diana, communicated with her through encrypted messages hidden in Braille music sheets. They developed a system where Sarah could relay information through seemingly innocent piano recital programs. Each musical piece listed corresponded to different types of intel about the group's activities. The operation faced its first major test when Wheeler began to grow suspicious of the new piano teacher. He started asking questions around town about her background. Sarah countered by inviting him to a student recital, knowing that seeing her interact with the children would help reinforce her cover as a harmless music teacher. During the recital, Wheeler sat in the back, watching intently. Sarah played a complex piece blindfolded, though she obviously didn't need it, to emphasize her disability. The performance convinced Wheeler. No one this vulnerable could possibly be a threat to their operation. What Sarah discovered during those months was more alarming than initially suspected. The Pure Nation Army wasn't just stockpiling weapons. They were planning a coordinated attack on several minority-owned businesses across Montana. They had infiltrated local law enforcement and had supporters in key government positions. As she pieced together the extent of their network, Sarah realized she was sitting on a powder cake. One wrong move could not only blow her cover but potentially put the entire town at risk. She needed to time her intel gathering perfectly to ensure the agency could move against all parts of the organization simultaneously. By the end of summer, Sarah had compiled an extensive dossier on the group's activities. But just as she was preparing to signal for the operation's final phase, something went wrong. Someone had noticed her dog Zeus paying too much attention to their vehicles, and they began to watch her more closely. The hunters were about to become the hunted, but they didn't know it yet. The autumn evening started like any other for Sarah. She had just finished her last piano lesson of the day and was walking home with Zeus. The air was crisp, and she could smell wood smoke from nearby chimneys, but something felt wrong. The usual evening sounds were different. There were too many engines idling in unusual places. Zeus tensed beside her, his breathing pattern changing slightly. Sarah had already counted 4 men following her, their footsteps trying too hard to be quiet. She could have easily avoided them, but her mission required her to maintain her cover as a helpless blind woman. She sent Zeus away with a secret command. The dog would return to their safe house and trigger a silent alarm. The attack came at the corner of Maple and Pine Streets. Sarah heard the van before it pulled up, its brakes squeaking slightly on the left side. She recognized the sound. It belonged to Mike Dawson, one of Wheeler's main lieutenants. "Hey, lady, need some help?" A gruff voice called out. Sarah recognized it as belonging to Pete Harris, a regular at the local diner who always smelled of cigarettes and gun oil. "No, thank you," Sarah replied, keeping her voice steady and scared, just as a blind woman might sound in this situation. "My dog will be back any moment." They didn't wait for Zeus to return. Two men grabbed her arms while another pressed a cloth to her face. Sarah took a calculated, shallow breath, enough to make them think the chloroform was working, but not enough to actually lose consciousness. She counted 6 men total, memorizing their breathing patterns and the sound of their movements. They loaded her into the van, being roughly gentle in that way kidnappers often are when they don't want to damage their prize. Sarah let her body go limp, focusing on memorizing every turn the van took. Left on Pine Street, she recognized the bumpy railroad crossing. Right onto Highway 12, the distinctive rumble of the cattle guard. Then onto a gravel road. She counted the seconds, estimating distance. The men talked freely, thinking she was unconscious. Sarah learned that Wheeler had ordered her kidnapping after one of his men spotted Zeus investigating their weapons cache behind the church. They thought she might be working with local law enforcement, but had no idea of her true identity. "Boss says to keep her alive until he figures out who she's working for," Dawson said. "No rough stuff unless she forces our hand." Sarah suppressed a smile. These men had no idea they were delivering her exactly where she wanted to be, their main compound. She had been trying to locate it for months, but it had been too well hidden. Now they were taking her right to it. After 23 minutes and 42 seconds, the van stopped. Sarah felt the change in air pressure as large doors opened. They were entering some kind of warehouse or barn. The smell of oil, gunpowder, and recently welded metal told her this was their main weapons facility. They carried her downstairs, 18 steps, and along a concrete hallway. The acoustics suggested a large underground structure. They placed her in a chair and tied her up, though not particularly well. Sarah could have slipped the ropes in seconds but remained still, listening and learning. Through the walls, she could hear activity in adjacent rooms. The clicking sounds of weapons being assembled, the beeping of what seemed to be electronic timing devices. She was building a mental map of the facility, gathering more intelligence in minutes than she had in months of surveillance. Wheeler arrived an hour later. Sarah recognized his uneven gait and wheezing breath. "Wake her up," he commanded. Someone splashed cold water on her face, and Sarah made a show of slowly regaining consciousness, playing the part of the terrified blind woman perfectly. "Miss Mitchell," Wheeler said, his voice attempting gentleness but failing. "We need to have a conversation about your dog's peculiar interests in certain parts of our town." I don't understand," Sarah stammered, adding a slight tremble to her voice. "Please, I'm just a piano teacher. What do you want from me?" "We'll get to that," Wheeler replied. "First, you're going to tell us who you're working for, and then we'll decide what to do with you." Sarah heard him pull up a chair, the metal legs scraping against concrete. She also heard something else, the slight crackle of a radio in the next room receiving a transmission. Her backup was in position. Everything was going according to plan. "Take your time," Wheeler said, trying to sound menacing. "We have all night." Sarah almost felt sorry for them. Almost. The interrogation room was filled with tension as Wheeler and his men surrounded Sarah. Through her heightened senses, she mapped out exactly where each person stood. Wheeler was directly in front, his breath carrying traces of coffee and whiskey. 2 guards flanked the door, and another paced behind her chair. "Last chance to make this easy on yourself," Wheeler said, tapping his fingers impatiently on the metal table. Sarah detected a slight tremor in his hand, a sign of nervousness that contradicted his confident tone. "Who sent you to spy on us?" Sarah maintained her terrified facade, letting tears roll down her cheeks. "Please, I don't know what you're talking about. I just teach piano. The children, they'll be waiting for their lessons tomorrow." One of the guards snickered. "Maybe we should show her what happens to people who stick their noses where they don't belong." "Shut up, Marcus," Wheeler snapped. The acoustics of his voice told Sarah he had turned to face the guard, temporarily taking his attention off her. "Perfect." "You know what's funny?" Sarah said, her voice suddenly dropping its fearful tone. "For people who think they're superior, you make such basic mistakes." The shift in her demeanor caught them off guard. She felt their heart rates spike, their breathing patterns change. Wheeler's chair scraped back as he stood up quickly. "What did you say?" he demanded. "For instance," Sarah continued calmly, testing the ropes with subtle movements, "you didn't pat me down properly, you didn't check my hair for pins, and most importantly," she smiled, "you tied these ropes like amateurs." In one fluid motion, Sarah broke free from her restraints. Before anyone could react, she had already calculated her first moves based on the positions of everyone in the room. She launched backward, her chair striking the guard behind her with precise force. The guard by the door reached for his weapon, but Sarah was already in motion. She caught his arm mid-draw, using his own momentum to slam him into Wheeler, who was still trying to process what was happening. The sound of their collision told her both men were temporarily incapacitated. Marcus, the second door guard, managed to fire a shot, but Sarah had already ducked, having heard his finger tense on the trigger. The bullet hit the concrete wall as she swept his legs out from under him. The impact of his head against the floor, calculated to stun but not cause permanent damage, echoed through the room. Wheeler scrambled to his feet, his breathing ragged with panic. "What the hell are you?" Sarah moved through the darkness with fluid grace, each strike precise and measured. "I'm what happens when you judge people by what you think are their weaknesses." She disabled the remaining guards with a series of quick strikes, targeting pressure points and weak spots she had identified from their movements earlier. The fight lasted less than 30 seconds, but to the men groaning on the floor, it felt like an eternity. Wheeler made a break for the door, but Sarah cut him off. His irregular footsteps made him especially easy to track. She caught him with a simple arm lock, one that her father had taught her years ago. "Impossible," Wheeler gasped as she held him in place. "You're blind." Sarah tightened her hold slightly. "Yes, I am. I'm also the person who's been documenting every illegal weapon you've smuggled, every attack you planned, and every bit of evidence needed to shut down your entire operation." The sound of multiple footsteps in the corridor told her that backup had arrived right on schedule. The door burst open, and she heard Diana's familiar voice barking orders as federal agents swarmed the room. "Clear," various voices called out. "Perfect timing," Sarah said, handing Wheeler over to the agents. "The weapons are in the East Wing, behind a false wall. You'll find their bombing plans in Wheeler's office upstairs, third floorboard from the window." Diana approached her, amusement evident in her voice. "Couldn't help showing off a little, could you?" Sarah shrugged, straightening her clothes. "They needed a lesson in making assumptions. Besides, I've been wanting to do that for months." As the agents led Wheeler and his men away, Sarah heard him mutter, "All this time, we were outsmarted by a blind woman." "No," Sarah corrected him, "you were outsmarted by an agent who happens to be blind. There's a difference." The compound buzzed with activity as more agents arrived to process the scene. Sarah stood in the middle of it all, finally able to drop her act as the helpless piano teacher. But her mission wasn't quite over. There were still loose ends to tie up, and the rest of the Pure Nation Army's network to dismantle. As federal agents secured the main interrogation room, Sarah's enhanced hearing picked up alarming sounds from deeper within the compound. Multiple footsteps, at least 15 armed men, were approaching from the lower levels. She recognized the distinctive sound of AK-47s being readied and tactical gear rustling. "Diana," Sarah whispered urgently, "we've got company. Wheeler's backup team is coming up through the tunnels." Diana immediately moved into action, but Sarah grabbed her arm. "Wait. The tunnels. They're rigged. I can hear the electrical current running through the detonators. They've activated their failsafe system." The compound's lights suddenly went out, plunging everything into darkness. Emergency generators kicked in, but Sarah could tell from the electrical hum that they were running on minimal power. For her, nothing had changed. For everyone else, the game had completely shifted. "Everyone cut radio chatter," Sarah commanded, taking charge of the situation. "The radio scanner is picking up our frequencies. They're using our own communications to track positions." The sound of gunfire erupted from the lower levels, bullets ricocheting off concrete walls. Sarah quickly mapped out their situation. They were on the second underground level, with hostile forces coming up from the third. The main exit was 2 floors up, but the elevators were disabled. "Follow my lead," Sarah instructed the team. "I know a way out they don't expect us to use." During her brief captivity, Sarah had analyzed the building's ventilation system. The air currents told her there was an old maintenance shaft that connected to a surface exit. Probably an emergency escape route the gang had planned to use themselves. Sarah led Diana and 4 other agents through the dark corridors, navigating by sound and air pressure. They encountered 2 armed gang members, but Sarah dealt with them silently, using their dependence on vision against them in the low light. "There's a maintenance door behind that false wall," Sarah whispered, pointing to their left. "The airflow pattern changes behind it." She ran her hands along the wall until she found the hidden latch mechanism. The door opened to reveal a narrow vertical shaft with a maintenance ladder. Sarah went first, counting the rungs as they climbed, listening for any movement above or below. The shaft was tight, but it would get them past the worst of the fighting. Halfway up, Sarah froze. "Stop," she whispered down to the others. "Someone's above us." Through the vibrations in the metal ladder, she felt 2 men moving on the level above, probably guarding the exit. Sarah calculated the distance and angles in her head, then made a decision. "Diana, when I give the signal, have everyone make as much noise as possible on the ladder." Sarah climbed until she was just below the exit hatch. When she was in position, she gave the signal. The agents below began shaking the ladder, creating a thunderous metallic clanging that echoed through the shaft. The guards above opened the hatch to investigate the noise, exactly as Sarah had predicted. She exploded upward through the opening, catching them completely by surprise. 2 quick strikes, and both guards were unconscious before they could raise an alarm. The shaft had led them to a small utility building about 100 yards from the main compound. Sarah could hear the ongoing firefight below ground, but they had successfully bypassed the worst of it. "Backup teams are entering from all directions," Diana reported, checking her phone. "The compound is surrounded." Sarah nodded, but her attention was elsewhere. She tilted her head, listening intently. 3 vehicles leaving through the north access road, but trying to escape with evidence. Diana immediately radioed the information to the perimeter teams. Within minutes, they heard the distant sound of screeching tires and shouts as the escaping vehicles were intercepted. As SWAT teams moved in to clear the compound, Sarah sat on a concrete barrier, finally allowing herself to relax slightly. Her part of the mission was technically over, but she knew there would be debriefings and follow-up operations to clean up any remaining cells of the organization. Diana sat next to her, handing her a bottle of water. "You know, when we recruited you, I never imagined you'd end up leading a tactical team through a dark compound." Sarah smiled, taking a sip of water. "People tend to think darkness is a disadvantage. They forget that for some of us, it's where we're most at home." In the distance, she could hear police sirens approaching and helicopters circling overhead. The operation was winding down, but Sarah knew this was just the beginning. There would be other missions, other challenges. But for now, she had helped strike a significant blow against a dangerous organization, and she had done it by turning their prejudices against them. The agency's command center hummed with activity as the final phase of Operation Blind Justice moved into action. Multiple screens displayed thermal images of the compound, while Sarah stood in the center of the room, providing crucial real-time intelligence based on her intimate knowledge of the Pure Nation Army's operations. Special Agent Thompson, leading the tactical response, leaned forward. "How do we get past the explosives?" "There's a maintenance panel in the ceiling," Sarah explained. "I memorized the layout during my piano lessons. The vibrations from their weapons testing helped me map the hidden rooms. The panel will give you access behind the trap." Teams moved into position around the compound. Sarah had provided them with detailed information about guard rotations, weapons caches, and security blind spots. Her months of gathering intelligence while posing as a piano teacher were proving invaluable. Movement in the western corridor called out a surveillance operator. Large group, heavily armed. Sarah tilted her head, processing the information. "That's their emergency response team. They'll have body armor and military-grade weapons. But they have a weakness. They'd always move in the same formation. Their heavy weapons specialist, Rodriguez, takes point. Take him out first, and the formation falls apart." The raid began precisely at midnight. SWAT teams breached the compound from multiple entry points simultaneously. Sarah had helped choreograph the assault to create maximum confusion among the defenders. "They're falling back to their secondary positions," Sarah announced, listening to the radio chatter. "But they don't know we've already secured their escape routes. Every fallback position they planned is already compromised." Inside the compound, the operation unfolded exactly as Sarah had predicted. The defenders found their carefully planned escape routes blocked, their hidden weapons caches already seized, and their communications jammed. The months she had spent memorizing their protocols and contingency plans were paying off. Jackson, as expected, made a break for his panic room. The tactical team, following Sarah's intelligence, accessed it through the maintenance panel and caught him in the act of shredding documents. The evidence was secured before he could destroy it. "We got something interesting," Diana reported from the field. "Hidden room under the chapel. Looks like international connections. Names, dates, bank accounts." Sarah nodded. "I heard them discussing meetings with European extremist groups during my surveillance. Check the hymn books on the third shelf. They used them to hide coded messages." The operation expanded beyond the compound as additional teams moved against identified members throughout the region. Sarah had mapped out the entire network, identifying safe houses, sympathizers, and corrupt officials who had helped protect the organization. "Police Chief Davis is trying to leave town," a surveillance team reported. "Let him," Sarah advised. "He'll lead us to their emergency funds. He always smelled of old leather and gun oil. He's carrying their backup cash in a leather briefcase he keeps in his gun safe." Hour by hour, the network crumbled. Sarah's detailed intelligence allowed the agency to move systematically, cutting off escape routes and securing evidence before it could be destroyed. Her ability to remember conversations, connect seemingly unrelated details, and map out the physical and social networks of the organization proved decisive. By dawn, the operation had yielded results beyond their expectations. Over 60 members of the Pure Nation Army were in custody. Weapons caches containing millions of dollars worth of illegal arms had been seized. Documents revealed connections to other extremist groups across the country. "Final numbers coming in," Diana announced. 27 safe houses raided, 43 bank accounts frozen, and 15 corrupt officials arrested. We've even got evidence linking them to 3 unsolved hate crimes from last year. Sarah sat quietly, her mission finally complete. The organization she had spent months infiltrating was dismantled, their plans for violence thwarted. Her perceived disability had been the perfect cover, allowing her to gather intelligence that no other agent could have obtained. "You know," Thompson said, placing a hand on her shoulder, "when you first joined the agency, some of us wondered if a blind agent could handle field operations. I don't think anyone's wondering that anymore." Sarah smiled. "Sometimes the best way to see the truth is to look beyond what's visible." As the sun rose over the Montana mountains, the Pure Nation Army's reign of terror came to an end, brought down by the very person they had underestimated most. The piano teacher who had seemed so helpless had proved to be their undoing. 3 months after Operation Blind Justice, Sarah sat in a quiet corner of the agency's cafeteria, her fingers moving across a confidential report in Braille. The takedown of the Pure Nation Army had created ripples throughout the intelligence community, leading to unprecedented changes in how agencies approach recruitment and tactical operations. "Your case study is now mandatory reading at Quantico," Diana said, sliding into the seat across from her. "Though, of course, they've changed your name and some details for security reasons. They're calling you the Invisible Observer." Sarah asked, pushing the report aside. "Better than expected," Diana replied. "Wheeler broke down completely in interrogation. He's given us information about 3 other extremist groups we hadn't even connected to the case. The evidence you gathered has led to over 200 arrests across 12 states." The operation's success had changed more than just the criminal landscape. Within the agency, attitudes toward agents with disabilities had undergone a dramatic shift. Sarah's techniques for using her other senses had been incorporated into standard training protocols. Several field offices had started actively recruiting individuals with various physical disabilities, recognizing that different perspectives and abilities could be valuable assets. "Thompson wants you to help design a new training program," Diana continued. "Something about teaching agents to operate effectively without relying on visual information. He says we've become too dependent on sight in our operations." Sarah nodded, recalling how many times she'd overcome security systems simply because their designers hadn't considered non-visual methods of detection. When do we start? Next month. But first, there's something else. Diana's voice carried a note of excitement. Remember those international connections we found in the chapel? They've led us to something bigger. We've identified a network operating across Europe and Asia. The director wants you to head up the investigation. Sarah's fingers stopped moving across the Braille document. An international operation. You'll be working with agencies from 6 different countries. Your unique abilities make you perfect for this. None of these groups would expect. Diana paused, choosing her words carefully. They'd never suspect someone like you. Sarah considered the implications. Her success in Montana had proved that being blind wasn't just not a handicap. It was genuinely an advantage in certain types of intelligence work. Her ability to process non-visual information, combined with people's tendency to underestimate her, made her uniquely suited for complex infiltration operations. What's the cover story this time? Sarah asked, already intrigued. How do you feel about being a concert pianist? Several major criminal organizations in Europe use high-end classical music events for meetings and money laundering. Your actual piano skills make this perfect. Sarah couldn't help but laugh. From small-town piano teacher to international concert pianist, my father always said I should dream bigger. As they discussed the details of the new operation, Sarah reflected on how far she'd come. The blind teenager who once struggled to navigate her school hallways was now helping to reshape how intelligence agencies approached covert operations. Her success had opened doors for others with disabilities, proving that different abilities could be powerful assets in the right circumstances. Oh, and one more thing, Diana added, sliding something across the table. The president wanted you to have this. Sarah ran her fingers across the medal, reading the Braille inscription. It was one of the nation's highest honors for intelligence work, though it would never be publicly acknowledged. The citation reads, "For extraordinary service to national security through innovative methods and exceptional courage," Diana explained. You've changed things, Sarah. You've shown that sometimes our perceived limitations can be our greatest strengths. Sarah carefully placed the medal in her pocket. Tomorrow, she would begin preparing for her new mission. There would be new challenges, new dangers, and new opportunities to prove that disability was just another word for different ability. Well, Sarah said, standing up, I should probably start practicing my Chopin. Can't have an undercover concert pianist hitting wrong notes. As she walked out of the cafeteria, her cane tapping lightly on the floor, agents nodded respectfully in her direction. She had earned their admiration not despite her blindness, but because of how she had turned it into her greatest asset. The blind piano teacher who had brought down a dangerous extremist organization had become a legend in the intelligence community. But for Sarah Mitchell, it was just the beginning of an even greater adventure.